Retro.
Hi, this is Fred Tatasciore, and you're listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. The Force is strong with both of them.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And we're going to take a trip back to the 80s to talk about Caravan of Courage and Ewok Adventure in this episode. But before we jump in the time machine, Jay, where can we be found around the internet?
All right. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. Doesn't matter what era of Star Wars you're talking about. We're there.
No, it does not. So, all right. Well, the dish is aligned. The signal's boosted to maximum output. Shields down. We're now broadcasting to the galaxy. So we are going back to talk about this made-for-TV Star Wars movie called Caravan of Courage. Full title is Caravan of Courage, an Ewok Adventure. It was originally released as an Ewok Adventure, but then when they kind of bundled it all up later and re-released it, they added the Caravan of Courage part, especially when they made a second made-for-TV movie about all this. Jay, you want to go ahead and give us this summary here, and then we'll talk a little bit about the history and then get into our discussion of the whole thing.
Sure, absolutely. So a family of four crash lands on the moon of Endor only to get separated. When the parents are captured by a giant known as the Gorax, the kids befriend a family of Ewoks and set out on an adventure to rescue them. Their quest takes them through the forests and across Endor as they recruit allies and overcome dangers and obstacles before arriving at the lair of the Gorax. After a dangerous confrontation, the giant is defeated and the children are reunited with their parents.
Right. So, like I said, it came out in 1984. It aired as an ABC Sunday night movie on November 25th. And then it later received a theatrical release in Europe, which is quite surprising to me, but that's neither here nor there. It was directed by John Cordy, who really hadn't done anything that I'd ever heard of besides this. George Lucas directed the pickup shots later on this. The script was by Bob Carroll, who also wrote for the Star Wars Ewoks animated series and Alvin and the Chipmunks, amongst other things. The story behind this is that after Return of the Jedi, George Lucas was interested in making an Ewok movie for his daughter, Amanda. And they primarily shot it in Marin County and the California Redwoods, which is very apparent if you look at the trees. Mm-hmm. And you can now watch it as part of the Vintage Star Wars collection on Disney+. So you got the summary, you got the history. Jay, what'd you think about this overall?
It was an experience. I do think before I jump in a little more, though, it's also good to note that Burl Ives is the narrator for this. So as soon as I heard his voice, I was thinking, oh gosh, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, silver and gold. It's that guy. But, starting off, I got into about the first 15 minutes of this and I thought, oh gosh, did the Ewoks really look that bad in Return of the Jedi? I don't remember them looking that bad. But, I had to put myself into the shoes of a kid in the 80s. And so when you think about when this came out in 1984, it was just a year after Return of the Jedi. And that was the height of Star Wars. The kids at the time were just all over Star Wars, and Ewoks were huge. Everyone loved these little furry guys. And so I think the timing of it for a made-for-TV movie was absolutely perfect. And when it comes right down to it, it's just a fun adventure for these kids. I mean, these kids that are the main impetus and basically the heroes of the movie go on this journey, this quest, and they learn a lot about themselves and a lot about what it means to work with other people and just the whole bravery part of it. And it's just an adventure, obviously, and that's why it's called an Ewok Adventure. So for what it is, It's a great little vintage film. It was at first a little hard to get through because I was thinking, "Oh gosh, what are we doing, Dennis?" But it was it was worth it. It was worth it in the end, just like the Star Wars holiday special, you gotta punch your fandom card, but I kept an open mind, and I actually did end up enjoying it at the end, I will admit.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah.
still say it's better than the holiday special.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. You didn't see it though back in the 80s as a kid, did you?
I didn't this was the first time I saw it,
Yeah.
so for me, it was very akin to, Flash Gordon. I loved that movie as a kid, and
Uh-huh.
I know we've talked about it a little bit on the show before. We're talking about the one with the Queen soundtrack,
Yeah.
Flash, that one. So this is kind of that campy, cheesy sort of feeling the same way. Acting is absolutely horrible, but it's okay because if I was a kid at the time, I would think this was the greatest thing ever.
Well, I did watch it back in 1984 and I loved it at that time. And I've watched it
Mhm.
a bunch of times. I think we ended up recording it somewhere or we had the video or something and I watched it a lot. And then there was a second movie that came after this called Battle for Endor, which, anyways, we'll talk about that some other time. It was a lot harder to watch this time around. A lot of things jumped out to me that did not jump out to me as a kid. And we'll get to those things as we discuss this here. You made a comment about the acting, and let's face it, when one of your lead actors is 4 years old,
Mhm.
there's only so much you can do on the acting front. When the majority of your characters are Ewoks wearing masks that have no other facial expressions except for a really terrifying toothy grin,
Yeah.
there's only so much you can do. And the Return of the Jedi costumes were much better than what
Oh,
was used
yeah.
here. They fit better. These looked like onesie pajamas put on
Mhm.
people. They were floppy and loose and everything else. And they're not that way in Return of the Jedi. You know, they, the Ewoks don't have a ton of facial expressions there either, but at least their mouths move,
Right.
when it comes down to it. But they're talking here and their mouths aren't moving. And then you'll see the actor's tongue going in and out of the teeth, which just was disturbing sometimes. But yeah, one of the things that stood out to me, you brought up Burl Ives, and I was going to talk about him when we got to the cast. You absolutely had to have a narrator for the beginning of this movie
Mhm.
because, and I think they learned from the holiday special when you had like 20 minutes of nothing but Ewoks grunt or Wookiees and the holiday special grunting at each other. You can't go by that. You had to have someone explain what these Ewoks were doing here. And especially with kids, you can't just rely on all the context clues here.
Right.
But still, you're right. As Burl Ives is like, wait a minute, where's Rudolph? Where, where's the sleigh on that? Okay, I want to get some of the negatives out of the way so we can talk about some of the other stuff that. And I'm sorry, but we will be picking on this movie quite a bit. That's just the way this conversation is going to go.
That's why it's fun. It
Yeah.
makes it fun. We're good. We're good.
What did you think of the fact that they used so many real world animals in this? There were goats, horses, ferrets, llamas, chickens, owls in this. That didn't bother me as a kid, but it really kind of bugged me when I was watching it this week.
Honestly, it didn't bother me that much because I felt like it was something that the, Ewoks would do, that they were very naturalistic, and that perhaps during I was making excuses in my head, of course, obviously, but
Uh-huh.
during Return of the Jedi, we didn't get to see as much of their day-to-day life as we got to see in this little adventure here. So, and I thought it was pretty appropriate because again, with kids being the ones that are watching this, kids love animals. And so it was just a great way, I thought, just to tie in some of the storytelling to it. I know when I saw the ferret, I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's a ferret!" Because I used to own a ferret when I was a
Yeah.
kid. So if I was watching this as a kid, because ferrets were like a big thing to own when you were in the 80s, it was like the niche kind of pet, almost like bearded dragons, I feel like are now. So I thought that was actually a stroke of genius that they used a lot of these different types of animals in this. But obviously it bothered you a little bit, but I was fine. I was fine
Yeah,
with it.
I don't think it bothered me at all as a kid, but
Mhm.
it unfortunately what it did is it highlighted that this was low budget for me
Right.
on this because
Yeah. Mm.
they did have a stop animation, like large wolf type creature that chases Sindel, the little
Mhm.
girl, and her big brother Mace. And then the Ewoks fight it off using some very classic techniques. That's a stop animation creature, and then they have the Ewoks, through force perspective, waving spears at it. So from behind, you get to see them kind of swinging their spears at the wolf, but then you get the wolf's point of view, and you got the Ewoks, stabbing up at them with the spears, and it works. It gets the point across there. And then you have that other creature. Mace sticks his Mace cannot be trusted in a forest by himself. He
No,
sees a
he is
little
the
creature,
whim of
and
his age. He can't
yeah,
leave anything alone.
there's a creature in a tree, and he goes over there, and he can't resist sticking his hand in to try and grab it, only to have a bigger creature bite his hand and like
Yeah,
drag it into the tree. And
that
it
could
was
help me.
just, yeah, some giant worm snake type thing that they pulled out. So, that was an effect as well. And then there was a spider in the Gorax's cave that is probably the fakest thing that they put in Star Wars today so far. Uh,
Mhm.
I mean, it barely moved at all, but it still managed to terrify them as they were crossing its little web bridge to try and get to where the Gorax was.
That
So,
spider was just terrifying, honestly, anyway. If I was a kid at that time, I would
yeah,
have nightmares about that, but I have to say, I mean, come on, another cave in Star Wars with spiders.
yeah.
We have
Well,
lots of spider caves in Star Wars.
yeah. One of the things that I want to talk about is kind of like what I felt like influenced this, and there was two big things I could point to. One was the Odyssey, and the second was Lord of the Rings.
Mm, mhm.
And the Lord of the Rings influence for me was that, you got the unlikely heroes, the hobbits, leaving Hobbiton to take this ring to a tower and pitch it into the lava to destroy it and defeat the evil. But in this one, you've got the unlikely heroes, the Ewoks, and these kids leaving the Ewok village, trekking across the planet to not a tower, but a very tall rock column. They infiltrate it in order to rescue the parents. And, Lord of the Rings has, what's her name? The spider that captures Frodo at one point. And now there's a
Oh,
spider in
yeah.
this cave as well. And so, you know, it's a little bit more than that. Again, you have, them stopping to make food, recruiting some allies along the way and the like that. And, very much that, the Odyssey, what stood out to me is that they get into a cave and there's a giant cyclops there that they have to fool and get around. Well, they get
Mhm.
into a cave, they have to get around the giant Gorax in this
Mhm.
case. So,
Mhm.
and there's
Yeah.
other things with Odyssey, number of little side quest adventures that distract them from their main adventure. One of which, again, Mace, just not being capable of leaving anything alone, finds a
Yeah.
pond and goes sticking his fingers in it, only to get pulled under the water and he can't get out.
Yeah,
Um,
that was a little odd. I wanna put a pin in that for just a second, but another thing that I got a little bit of a vibe on with this is actually Wizard of Oz, because as you mentioned, they were recruiting these different allies along the way. So they had those little, talismans, and there was, Mace got the rock, which he absolutely hated,
yeah.
and then, he was like, "It's just a double rock."
Uh-huh.
And then there was the tooth, and then there was that crystal. So then they had to go to the different parts, along the way, and then they had this axe, this huntsman, this woodsman, right?
Yep.
So throwing the axe, and then they had the sorceress or this wizardress or whatever she was. And so they
Or
recruited her
Gandalf.
on their little journey. Yeah. So it was almost like, oh, okay, here's the Tin Man. And oh, okay, here's the Scarecrow, and follow the yellow brick road kind of thing. I mean, even at one point, Mace was even marching a little bit as he was
Yep.
following the Ewoks along the way. But yeah, the whole thing though with the pond being this sort of magical, vortex, if you will, that pulls Mace into it. What the heck? This is a thing on Endor? Magical
Well,
pools of
it
water
was
that suck you
only
in?
it was only there to make Wicket's gift make sense. That's one thing we have
Right.
also forgot to mention, Wickets in
Yeah.
this from Return of the Jedi.
Mhm.
And so, Wicket got the magic walking stick. Why you would give the youngest Ewok in the adventure a walking stick is beyond me. But it's a magic walking stick. It was the only thing that could penetrate the water without getting sucked into the magic pond and
Mhm.
lost. to them,
Mhm.
and they used it to drag Mace out. Mace would have drowned
Oh,
given
yeah.
how long he was underwater there. But it's not like Mace actually learned anything from this experience, right? I mean, it's not like he had any great epiphany afterwards. It was an extra scene. I don't know that contributed to the story, but one of the things I read about this is that, they ABC agreed to air this, but they needed something that would run 2 hours with the commercials. Well, you take that out and you're what else did they cut? Because it's like, not that they couldn't really afford to lose that time. That scene lasted like 5 minutes.
Mhm.
And it didn't accomplish anything.
Mhm. Yeah, not really. Other than the fact, like you said, it was just a vehicle for Wicket to be able to use his magic little stick. But yeah, again, if I was a kid watching this, I would have been terrified because I've always been afraid of drowning anyway.
Yeah.
And to see Mace underneath this glass, kind of uh almost barrier between being able, like, could you imagine? It's almost like being underneath ice. And just that feeling of that is just, oh, that's awful. But at any
Mhm.
rate, I have to ask you a question real
Sure.
quick. Did you think that Mace, the young man that played Mace, was almost a Mark Hamill look-alike? Like he resembled a young Mark Hamill, I feel like, in a lot of ways.
I think he was very deliberately picked, and I haven't researched this, but, consider the costume they had. It was this orange jumpsuit type costume.
Like
He
an
had a white
X-Wing.
vest.
Yeah.
Yeah, that looked very much like an X-wing pilot. Similar type of '70s haircut,
Uh-huh.
that Hamill had, and, well, not super similar, but close enough on
Oh,
there.
yeah.
And yeah, I think he was deliberately chosen because he kind of fit that mold. I
Mhm.
think that's a good observation as well.
Mhm. And he was very Luke-esque in some ways too. Just always, as Yoda would say, never his mind on where he was and what he was doing. He was
Yeah,
always questioning everything, and this isn't gonna work, and this is so dumb, and this is this, and this is that. I mean, Luke wasn't that bad,
right.
but yeah, that was definitely the impetus to a lot of the
Well,
awful
he's
things that
impatient.
ended up happening. Yeah. He
Yeah, just like
finally
we was.
did yeah, he finally did obviously really appreciate what the Ewoks were doing and really ended up treasuring them, but
Uh-huh.
not until the very end. He was very almost annoying in some ways. It's like, "Mace, just do it. Take the dumb rock and just go."
Yeah, he threw the rock away only to have one of the Ewoks
Wicket
pick it up.
picked
Yeah,
it up.
Wicket,
Yeah.
pick it up and give it back to him. Then it had that arrowhead, which became useful later. Okay, I picked on this. There are some things that I did want to compliment, though. Again, it's clearly low budget when you see it, and there was movies in the '80s that didn't have the power of Lucasfilm behind them. Industrial Lights and Magic that came up with better effects than this. But again, they had a limited amount of time, limited budget. I think they did this whole thing like 8 weeks. They pulled it off, but they used some very standard techniques like force perspective, which you talked about, glass paintings.
Mhm.
One of the things that was bugging me at the beginning of the movie was they weren't in Bright Tree Village. The Ewoks, Wicket's family was living in this hut on the ground, and I was like, oh, that's a bummer. But then later they go to the village to meet Logray, who uses that magic spinning top to show them their parents,
Yeah, it's like a
and all
little
like that.
dreidel.
Yeah, exactly. But then they get to Bright Tree Village there, and it's scenes like that, and then a few other places where they take us out of Marin County and they actually make an alien looking landscape. So, the beginning of the movie does not look like Endor at all. One of the great
Mm-mm.
accomplishments, or this really made me appreciate Return of the Jedi and what they did for Endor. Yes, it was shot in a redwood forest, but they shot it in such a way that you were always in the forest. You were always
Right.
surrounded by these gigantic trees. And that's not to say that Endor couldn't have other terrains, but it just seemed a little too much Earth-like until, we got those shots of Bright Tree Village and what they were doing with the redwoods. And that looked really great, I thought.
Mhm. Oh,
Um,
yeah, definitely.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, to your point too, I mean, even from the very beginning when, I think it was Wicket's dad was trying to use that glider, you
Uh-huh.
could just tell that they were on some sort of rocky edifice somewhere in California. I mean, it was
Yep.
quite obvious. Whereas one of the things that Return of the Jedi and all the Star Wars movies did so well was even though they were made in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, it didn't feel like that at all. And that's why it stood the test of time. This definitely felt like it was shot in the backyard kind of thing. So, yeah, so there's definitely that. But
Yeah.
there was a lot of good things about the movie though, as you said to point out. I mean, it was a heartfelt story. I mean,
Mhm.
at its core, it's about family, courage, the bond between these two siblings, and just the fact that they had to be determined to rescue their parents, and that's pretty touching, and it's got a lot of bravery in it, and the kids are really resilient. I mean, at one point, Sindel gets super sick and they have to put their trust in the Ewoks to be able to cure her. They have this whole language barrier that they have to get around, which they eventually do. And it's kind of a good underdog story, and it does have some charm. I mean, when you look at it from that point of view.
Yeah, what'd you think of Wicket talking?
Oh, that was just yeah, weird. And, just, the idea I actually had the subtitles on for most of it, so I was cracking myself up because it was saying, speaking Ewokese, and then you got the
Yeah.
yub nub constantly, yub nub this, yub nub that, but, and then they were trying to, uh, imitate the basic or English that the kids were saying, "Starship crash,"
Yep.
sort of thing. So, I mean,
Starship
it
fly,
was
starship
Starship
crash.
crash. So a little cringy, not gonna lie, but again, it's kind of part of the campy charm in a way too. What do you think?
Well, I mean, okay, one of the things about the talk is like, wait, when did this happen? If
Mm, mhm,
it's been set aside, it's not part of Star Wars canon anymore. It's had some references here and there, but if it takes place before Return of the Jedi, then why couldn't Wicket talk to Leia,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And then if it happened afterwards, why were the Ewoks so surprised to see people?
mhm,
Was the thing I had here. Now, accordingly to some research I did on this, that the movie before it was set aside was considered to be 3 ABY. So that would have been before Return of the Jedi, or right about the same time as Return of the Jedi. Well, no, it would have been around the same time as The Empire Strikes Back, which is problematic. But while they were shooting, the thought was is that they were 154 years ABY. But
mm,
they abandoned that because it would have made sense. Wicket still would have been way too young for 154 years after the Battle of
mhm.
Yavin.
Right,
But so, I mean, just to me, it kind of screams from the get go that this really isn't a story to be taken seriously as part as the overall canon there. Um,
definitely.
yeah, I mean, like I said at the top, this really is a movie directed at kids. And I guess George Lucas was comfortable with going with a 4-year-old as one of his leads because it was made for his very young daughter and she could see herself in that character. But Sindel was very limiting in this because it's not like she could engage in a whole lot of acting. I mean, not that she could do a whole lot of sophisticated talking at the age of 4 when it came down to it. She was really relegated to doing a lot of things like, I miss mommy and daddy. It hurts. It hurts. Mace, it hurts. That's like the bulk of her lines in this
Mhm,
thing. But it is what it is. Mace got to be the hero of this, and take care of his sister and rescue his parents. Um, the Gorax, for me, that was actually one of the best things about this entire special. But what did you think about this creature?
he actually had a little Predator vibes. Not
Oh,
gonna
I hadn't thought of
lie.
it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, he's the big fee fi fo fum giant that is trying to keep his catch from being rescued, and you wonder what he was gonna do with them, the parents. Was he gonna eat them? Was he just gonna keep them as a prize, as just prisoners? But, yeah, I agree. It was definitely a likable type of a villain, and it was a fun climax to the entire story to see him being defeated. So I really appreciated the Gorax. I thought it
I
was cool.
thought they spent a lot more effort designing the Gorax than they did in making the Ewoks look right
Oh
in this
yeah.
special. He had a mouth that moved.
Mhm.
His makeup was more impressive than the costumes that the Ewoks had. One of the things I love is that when the online role playing game Star Wars Galaxies came out in the early 2000s, the Gorax was something you could go fight on Endor if you wanted to.
Oh
And
really? Oh, that's cool.
yeah, and it wasn't always an easy fight. You actually had to get some experience to be able to take one of those things down. Helped if you had some friends there, but there would be a number of them that were around that you could hunt down for stuff. Um, but I did. It is kind of laughable that he had the kids' parents trapped in a cage, the bars of which were far enough a point that they just could have climbed out. Because
Yeah,
Mace,
I got that too.
Mace
'Cause he
uses
was
that
able to
rope,
get
throws it
in.
up there so he can climb up, and then he just climbs right through the bars. It's just like, okay, that's quite the case. Now they were off the ground, so maybe it wouldn't have made much sense for them to try and just jump for it, but still, um, not exactly the most difficult thing to get out of. So,
Mhm.
but hey, it works. It very much is a Jack of the Beanstalk type of an element there. Another carryover from this show is the Wisties. That was those little light like fairies that they ran into that one night while they were camping. And then they kind of made friends with one of them. And then they used it to distract the Gorax once they got into its lair. These things show up in Battlefront 2 when you are playing the Ewok Hunt
Oh
side
my
game.
goodness.
Side
Yeah.
game. Yeah, they throw a pouch of those at stormtroopers, and if you're playing as a stormtrooper, your character becomes disoriented, and it does a gradual wear down of your health while it's at it. And I hate it if I was playing a stormtrooper have those things thrown at me because you know you don't last long as a stormtrooper once that happens. You're just a couple hits away from getting killed and turned into an Ewok yourself.
Oh my gosh. That I love the fact though that that made the jump into something like that, with the game because I didn't even make that connection. They were just these little like light grenade kind of things,
Mhm.
basically.
Yeah,
But yeah, they end up befriending the one called Ezerina.
yeah.
And that was the one that ended up helping them almost, kind of buzzing around the Gorax's head to distract it long enough for them to be able to do what they needed to do. But yeah, I would love to see them again, quite honestly. There was kind of a very interesting little race of humanoid, light fragments, if nothing else.
It looked like a radioactive Tinkerbell.
Yeah, I
Uh,
know. I thought the same thing. Like at the end, I'm like, oh, there goes Tink.
yeah,
Bye.
yeah. When Mace basically tells it's time for her to go find her family. Yeah, after
hmm
she helped him out there. So what else? What else about this stood out to you?
Just, the like you were talking about with the practical effects. I mean, all of the things like we already talked about the spider and the costumes and even just some of the sets and things like that. I mean, it was very obviously 80s and obviously low budget, but I mean, they love it or hate it. It's bizarre, but it's also undeniably unique, in a lot of ways as well. And so again, we have to just take it for what it is, and I think that there's a lot to be said for what it was trying to do at the
Uh-huh.
time, and it's definitely something that I'll never forget. I will say that. I
Yeah,
don't know if I'll ever watch it again, but
yeah. I mean, I had very fond memories of it from a kid, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. And the second movie, which I we're gonna have to watch and cover on this show. There's some very
okay.
interesting things. Well, there was some
No,
more
I'll
even.
totally do it.
I was gonna say there's even more direct references that picked up in other Star Wars that come from out of that
Oh,
movie.
okay.
Also, potentially, Night Sisters. You
Ooh,
be the judge
okay.
of that one.
Alright,
Uh,
you got me. You got me
yeah.
hooked.
Well, and there's some very shocking things that happen at the beginning of that movie, but we'll save that for when we actually get around to discussing it. But like I was saying, this was a movie I liked quite a bit as a kid. Watched it several times, and I haven't watched it in decades. And so revisiting it, I was like, wow. When I talk about rose-colored glasses, I had some
Sure.
very fond, nostalgic memories of this thing, and it didn't live up to that, and that's fine. It's watching it now, it's like, wow, that clearly was aimed at kids. It could have been better. I am really curious how it would have turned out if George Lucas had done it, say, in like 2004, after
Mm.
he
Mhm.
developed all of his CGI technology. How would that wolf-like creature have turned out? How would the Gorax have turned out? What kind of environments would they used, as opposed to relying so heavily on Marin County there?
Mhm.
Would he have invested that money at all in something? But he had so much more at that point, you know?
Right.
So yeah, I'm curious what this would have looked like if he had done it later on that. But it's worth watching once, I think, especially if you
Sure.
have young kids.
Oh, yeah.
Just set the bar low, and I think is the way to go for that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for something a little different, something, little walky, wacky,
Yeah.
yeah, give it a try. But
All
yeah,
right.
like you said, it's a fun piece of Star Wars history, and you just have to take it for what it is.
Indeed. Indeed. All right, then. Well, that'll do it for our discussion of Caravan of Courage on this episode of Podcast Stardust. Thank you all for joining us. If you want more of our coverage of Star Wars, and we cover all kinds of stuff, then make sure you hit the subscribe button on your podcatcher of choice. And we always appreciate it when you like, rate, review, subscribe, comment, wherever it is that you listen to your podcast. That really helps us out. And we just like hearing from our listeners. If you want to catch more of our back catalog beyond the 100 or 200 episodes that you're going to find in our podcatcher, then head over to retrozapp.com, and you can find all the other great shows that are there, such as Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Case Files, Animaniacast, Brews and Blasters, Dork Lair, Doomcast, Enjoy Stuff, Love, Death, and Robots Plus, Superhero Suite, Warp Trails, and more. Jay, why don't you go ahead and remind everybody one more time what our social media contacts are and the other places we can be found online.
Sure. We've definitely been having a lot of fun. This was such a great episode and such a fun one. So we'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And you can connect with us on Facebook and Instagram very conveniently at Podcast Stardust. And you can always check out all of our Pinterest boards. And we do have our 2 YouTube outlets. So we have the traditional YouTube as well as YouTube Music. So if you have something that you want to comment, you can definitely do that on both of those. And we would also encourage you to subscribe to both of those and share those out with your friends too, because that is how we grow. And we do have a T Public store, and the link to that will be in our show notes. I think we need a new Yub Nub design, but we do have 7 different show logo designs available on all kinds of things from home goods and apparel and literally everything in between. So, once again, hit up that link in our show notes.
All right, Jay, what is going on in cosplay?
All right. Well, no Ewok costumes to speak of anytime soon, but you can catch all of my other adventures on my Instagram, which is j.snipscosplay. And so you can catch me as my many characters, including Ahsoka, 2 different versions of Hera, the Fourth Sister, as well as my original concept Mandalorian based on a Legends character named Tahiri Vela. And then I also have some Leia dabbled in there as well, Leia from Endor, as a matter of fact. And then I have a couple of new projects coming up this spring as well. So once again, you can check that out at j.snipscosplay.
Okay, upcoming on the show on Friday, we'll be wrapping up the week with a look at some Star Wars news. And then on Monday, we'll be kicking off the next week with another discussion of the Clone Wars. So, with that said, thanks for listening to episode 844 of Podcast Stars, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time, may the Force be with you.